student went out for a bike ride, but never made it back home. From the very first days, her disappearance sparked one of the largest searches the city had ever seen. And soon, the whole country was talking about this case. Detectives chased down thousands of tips and looked into hundreds of suspects, but every lead turned into a dead end. That's how it went, until an unexpected twist finally revealed the chilling truth. Ardith Wood was born on October 28, 1975, in St. John, Canada. Not long after, she became a big sister to two younger brothers, and the family eventually moved to Ottawa. That's where Ardith went through Catholic school and later enrolled in university, diving into history and philosophy. After earning her degrees, she decided to keep going and enrolled at another university near Toronto to pursue a PhD in philosophy. Ardith was genuinely passionate about it and pictured herself teaching at a top university one day. Her professors often remarked on her exceptional talent. In fact, at times they felt like they were talking to a colleague rather than a student. Outside the classroom, she was active and athletic. She loved swimming, running, and cycling. She also dreamed of having a big family, and she was in a serious relationship, planning to marry her boyfriend after finishing her PhD. In the summer of 2003, when she was 27, Ardith decided to visit her family in Ottawa and spend 2 weeks with them. Her university was about 300 miles away from home, so she didn't get to see her loved ones very often. Since they were such a close-knit family, being apart for that long was tough on her, and she planned to spend as much time with them as possible during her break. On the morning of August 6th, Ardith got up early and went for a run. When she came back, she made a strawberry dessert for her parents and brothers. Later that day, she and her mom were planning to go shopping, but the forecast warned that heavy rain was on the way. So, Ardith decided to head out for a bike ride while the weather was still holding up. She promised her mom she'd be back in about an hour and a half, borrowed her brother's bike, and rode off. An hour and a half later, the rain the forecast had promised finally came pouring down, but Ardith still hadn't returned. Her mom figured she'd gotten caught in the storm and was probably waiting it out under some kind of shelter. But as time passed, the rain stopped, and Ardith was still nowhere to be seen. Worried, her mom called her husband, who quickly went out with their sons to search for her. They drove along the city's long park trail, a popular spot for cyclists. As kids, Ardith and her brothers had spent countless hours biking there, so her family assumed that's where she might have gone. But it was only a guess. Before leaving, Ardith hadn't told anyone exactly where she planned to ride, and her father and brothers couldn't find any trace of her. By then, it was already starting to get dark, and her family was in a panic. More than 6 hours had passed since she'd left the house, and they were almost certain something bad had happened. They decided it was time to call the police. But the local police department didn't launch a full search right away, since Ardith was 27 years old. Her family, though, refused to just sit around and wait. They started calling friends and neighbors, asking them to help. Dozens of people joined the search, coming through bike trails all over the city late into the night. Still, there was no sign of Ardith. The biggest problem was that Ottawa's bike paths stretched more than 100 miles, and no one knew which route she had taken. All they could do was guess that she'd chosen the closest one to home. The next morning, police finally joined the search and set up a command post at the Aviation Museum, a spot where several major bike trails intersected. They brought in dozens of officers and also reached out to the public for help. Photos of Ardith were handed out to newspapers and TV stations, and volunteers were urged to join the search. The community's response was overwhelming. Within just hours, hundreds of locals joined the search. Mounted police showed up, along with helicopters and even the military. Very quickly, the search for Ardith became one of the biggest in Ottawa's history. But, despite the massive effort, there was still no trace of her. News of Ardith's disappearance spread quickly across the city, and soon police were flooded with hundreds of calls and tips. In the very first days, several women came forward with eerily similar stories. Each of them said they'd been approached by a man, and from their descriptions, it sounded like the same guy every time. They explained that he would approach them on bike paths or park trails that ran along the river, not far from the very spot where police had set up their command post. One woman told officers that he rode up to her on a bike, and at first he seemed very nice. He was fit, good-looking, and started off with casual small talk, but then out of nowhere he tried to pull her off her bike and drag her into the trees. Terrified, she managed to break free and spent away. Based on her account, police were able to create a composite sketch of the suspect. But they decided not to release it to the public. They were already overwhelmed with tips, and without solid evidence to connect him to Artith's disappearance. Putting out the sketch would only create even more noise. Even if someone recognized him and gave them a name, they'd have no way to prove the link. So they held off. But in the following days, more women came forward with nearly identical stories. A man matching the same description approached them in local parks, acted strangely, and in some cases even tried to drag them off the trail into the woods. Another lead came from a 16-year-old girl who had been riding her bike in the park. She told police that she'd seen Artith's photo on the news and immediately recognized her, because she'd actually spotted her in the park on the day she vanished. According to the teen, she rode past Artith, but just a few seconds later heard a woman scream. When she turned around, she saw Artith standing with a man, and it looked like they were arguing. She kept going, but when she looked back again, she saw the man walking into the woods with Artith beside him. Something about it didn't feel right, so she circled back. By the time she returned, though, they were gone. Curious but uneasy, she went a little further into the trees. First, she noticed a hat hanging on a branch. Then, just a few steps later, she came across 2 bikes lying on the ground. But there was no sign of Artith or the man, and at that point, she decided not to go any deeper. She convinced herself she might just be overthinking things, that maybe she'd only witnessed a couple having an argument. As she rode away, though, she thought she heard another scream. She couldn't be sure if it was real or if her mind was playing tricks on her. When police later showed her the composite sketch created from the other women's descriptions, she confirmed that it looked a lot like the man she saw with Artith that day. This pushed detectives towards the theory that Artith had been abducted, and now they had a better idea of where it might have happened. They swept through the park with hundreds of volunteers, and even brought in divers to search the long, narrow river running through the area. For days after Artith went missing, the effort finally paid off. Divers pulled a bike from the bottom of the river, and the serial number confirmed it belonged to Artith's brother. At that point, detectives realized the chances of finding her alive were slim, and they shifted all their focus to the riverbanks. That same day, police got a call unlike any of the tips they'd received before. On the other end of the line was a man who sounded panicked. He said he had accidentally killed Artith near a bike path. According to him, it wasn't planned. It was some kind of accident. He went on to say that afterward, he partially buried her body near the riverbank and covered it with branches. Investigators traced the call and learned it had come from a payphone in a nearby town. They rushed to the scene, hoping the caller might have left behind fingerprints or DNA on the phone. But once again, they came up empty. Meanwhile, police brought in search dogs to comb both sides of the river where Artith's bike had turned up. And the very next day, the dogs led them to a body lying just a few feet from the water, partially hidden under branches. The decomposition was so advanced that investigators couldn't identify it by sight, and there were no clothes on it. But they knew almost instantly it had to be Artith. They turned the remains over to medical examiners and combed the crime scene. But there was nothing, no footprints, no belongings, nothing that could point them toward a suspect. Later, medical experts confirmed the victim was Artith. They determined she had drowned, most likely held underwater until she died. Afterward, her killer dragged her onto the riverbank and tried to cover her with branches. Since police couldn't find any of her clothing, it was clear the killer had taken it with him. Examiners couldn't say for sure if Artith had been sexually assaulted, but everything about the scene pointed strongly in that direction. After Artith's body was found, investigators decided to release the composite sketch of the suspect, and it triggered a flood of new tips. Many women said a man matching that description had harassed them in local parks, but none of it brought police closer to putting a name to the face. Over time, detectives built a list of several hundred possible suspects, checking each one carefully, but still couldn't tie anyone directly to Artith's murder. They also looked into the possibility that a serial offender was responsible. Same man who had assaulted several women in the nearby town where the confession call to police had come from. That predator had attacked multiple women just a year earlier and was never caught. Detectives tried hard to link the two cases, but once again they hit a dead end. Even so, tips kept flooding in, and investigators were struck by how many women had run into a man who looked like the composite sketch. But when they pieced it all together, they realized he'd been spotted in that very park at least 19 times in the week before Ardith disappeared. Even more chilling, one woman saw him the day after the murder, before Ardith's body had been discovered. Detectives believed he might have returned to the scene to hide the body better, or to collect evidence before police could find it. There was one more detail witnesses kept bringing up. Many of them said the man had an eagle tattoo on his shoulder. At first, detectives kept that information to themselves because it was their strongest lead. But as the weeks dragged on and they were no closer to making an arrest, they decided to release it to the public. As a result, hundreds of calls came in about men with similar tattoos. Detectives followed up on every single one. But once again, it led nowhere. In the months that followed, detectives kept working through the flood of tips. More than 4,000 in total. They tried to chase down every lead, which was an overwhelming task. Eventually, though, two specific calls caught their attention. One came in shortly after Ardith's body was found, and the other arrived months later. But both callers pointed to the same man, a local who lived in the same town where the confession call had been made from that payphone. In fact, he lived in the very neighborhood where that payphone stood. On top of that, he had a criminal record, and he had a bird tattoo on his shoulder that matched what witnesses described. Detectives brought him in for questioning, and his behavior was strange. At one point, he even told them they'd never figure out what he was doing on the day Ardith was killed, because he was as elusive as a scorpion. Investigators grilled him for 3 hours, but he gave them nothing useful. So they called him back for a second interview, this time with a polygraph. By then, detectives were nearly convinced this was their guy, but the results completely blindsided them. The polygraph examiner didn't flag a single lie. With no hard evidence to hold the suspect on, detectives had no choice but to let him go. And the clean polygraph results left them questioning whether he was really their suspect after all. Over time, the flood of tips finally dried up. But detectives kept going through the old ones, one by one. A year after the murder, their lead investigator told reporters that they were still working through their suspect list, which had around 400 men on it. Most had already been ruled out, but a chunk of them were still question marks. Police also put up a $50,000 reward, the biggest ever put up in Ottawa at the time. But not even that was enough to bring them any closer to finding the killer. By the 2-year mark, detectives had run out of leads, and the case basically went cold. That's how it stayed until September 2005, when another young woman vanished in Ottawa. 18-year-old Jennifer Teague, whose story we've already covered on this channel. Investigators immediately looked for a possible link, since the two cases seemed so similar. But in the end, no connection was ever found. After that, the case sat cold for almost another year, and detectives were beginning to doubt they'd ever solve it. They had no physical evidence, and despite all the eyewitness accounts, they still couldn't put a name to the mysterious man seen in the park. But then, on May 2006, everything suddenly changed. Police in North Bay, a city about 190 miles from Ottawa, got a call from an attempted assault. A woman reported that she was walking home late at night when a man approached her and asked if he could walk with her. She said no and kept going, but he followed, claiming he needed help. He told her he had just moved from Ottawa and couldn't find the address he was looking for. As she started giving him directions, the man suddenly grabbed her and dragged her into the bushes. He tried to assault her, but the woman screamed and nearby residents heard it. One man even ran outside with a shovel and scared the attacker off. The suspect bolted, dropping his phone as he ran. That mistake cost him dearly. Police quickly tracked him down and arrested him. The man was 25-year-old Christopher Myers, who had only recently moved to North Bay from Ottawa. While preparing the case against him, the lead detective suddenly remembered hearing about the Ardith Wood case at a police conference. He dug out the handouts from that event, and among them was a composite sketch of the suspect. The resemblance to Christopher was uncanny. He immediately passed the tip on to investigators in Ottawa, who started taking a closer look at Myers. The first thing they realized was that police had actually spoken to Christopher in the early weeks after Arda's disappearance. An anonymous tipster had called the hotline and named him as a suspect. Detectives had checked him out, but found nothing solid linking him to the crime. He even seemed to have an alibi. The woman who rented him a room said she'd seen him earlier in the day, and by 3 p.m., he had already left for his work shift. Since Ardith was believed to have been attacked around 1.30, it seemed likely he simply wouldn't have had the time to be in the park. About a year later, Christopher's name popped up again when another tip came in. This time, police decided to take a closer look at him and brought him in for questioning. He denied having anything to do with Ardith's murder, and even showed them his shoulders to prove he had no tattoos, something that made detectives doubt whether he really was their guy. But now, with Christopher back on their radar for the third time, and given the fact that he had just tried to drag another woman into the bushes, detectives started seeing him as their prime suspect. The problem was they still needed hard evidence to prove it. The first thing they did was revisit his alibi. Originally, his landlady had told police she saw him at home during the day, which seemed to clear him. But when investigators went back and spoke with her again, she clarified that she had actually seen him in the morning. That small detail changed everything. It meant that he had plenty of time to ride his bike from his house to the park, attack Ardith, and still make it to his afternoon shift. To be sure, police even retraced the entire route by bike themselves and confirmed it was absolutely possible. Eventually, detectives went to the neighboring city to question Christopher. At first, he flat out denied having anything to do with it. But when they told him that multiple women had spotted him in the park, his story started to change. He admitted he'd been riding his bike there that day, and even claimed he ran into Ardith and struck up a conversation with her. According to Christopher, after a brief chat, Ardith supposedly agreed to walk with him into the woods by the river. But then, he claimed, another girl appeared, spooking Ardith and causing her to fall into the water. He said he left right away, but later came back only to find her already drowned. That's when he claimed he pulled her body onto the shore, covered it with branches, and simply walked away without telling anyone what had happened. Detectives knew the story was complete nonsense, but at the same time, Christopher had just admitted to having contact with Ardith on the day of the murder. What's more, the other girl in his tale sounded a lot like the 16-year-old witness who reported hearing a scream and spotting Ardith with a man before they vanished into the woods. It seemed like Christopher had taken her account from the news and twisted it into his own version. Not long after, he backtracked again, saying the whole story was a lie. He claimed he had never been in the park at all, that he had only heard about Ardith's case from the news, and made everything up based on publicly available details. Detectives then put him on a polygraph and he failed. Even so, Christopher kept insisting he was innocent, and without solid physical evidence, police couldn't charge him with murder. While Christopher was still behind bars in the neighboring city, detectives started digging into his past, hoping to uncover anything that could tie him to Ardith's murder. They learned that his mother had been drinking and using drugs while pregnant, which left Christopher with mental health issues from an early age. To make matters worse, she physically abused him until, at age 4, he was adopted by another family. But 8 years later, even they gave up on him. His behavior had become deeply disturbing and impossible to manage. He talked to himself constantly, stripped naked in public, and grew more aggressive with each passing year. One psychologist who treated him even said Christopher was the most frightening child he had ever worked with. On the surface, his adult life looked more stable. He managed to hold a job, find housing, and mostly stayed off the police radar, aside from a few Dick-related arrests. He even had girlfriends, and detectives tracked some of them down to ask about his past. One ex described how Christopher would frequently fly into rages and sometimes hit her. She also confirmed that he was always riding his bike around parks. But then she told detectives something that stunned them. Christopher had a habit of giving himself temporary tattoos, and more than once, she'd seen an eagle tattoo inked onto his shoulder. This information became the missing piece of the puzzle, the final detail that convinced detectives Christopher really was their guy. Up until then, The tattoo could have blown the whole case apart. If he really hadn't had it, every eyewitness account would have fallen flat. But with a witness now confirming he did have that eagle tattoo on his shoulder, detectives knew they weren't chasing shadows anymore. Still, it wasn't nearly enough to bring the case to trial. What they needed was a confession. 5 months after his arrest for the attempted assault, detectives brought him back in for questioning, this time with backup. They invited in an experienced investigator from the UK, someone with a reputation for getting people to talk. At first, Christopher flat out denied having anything to do with Ardith's murder, but later he slipped back into the same story he told before. The one about meeting her by the river, kissing her, and then claiming she drowned after another girl startled her. Then, just as quickly, he took it all back. But not long after, he drew detectives a map showing where he said he first met Ardith and the spot where they supposedly went together. He even agreed to take them out there and point everything out in person. But once they actually arrived, Christopher suddenly changed his tune again, saying he didn't recognize the park at all. So, while his story wasn't a full confession, it was just enough to keep him on the hook. But detectives had something else up their sleeve. They believed Christopher might not only be tied to Ardith's murder, but also to a string of unsolved sexual assaults that had happened around Ottawa at the very same time. The pattern was always the same. A man would approach women on the street, strike up a conversation, then suddenly attack and sexually assault them. When police spoke to the victims and showed them Christopher's photo, several of them confirmed without hesitation. He was the one who attacked them. Armed with this, detectives hauled him in for another round of questioning. This time, after hours of pressure, Christopher finally broke and admitted to 5 separate assaults. That confession gave police what they needed, additional charges, and, combined with everything else, a much stronger case against him for Ardith's murder. In the end, Christopher was finally charged with murder, and the case went to trial. Took years to get there, but in January 2008, prosecutors put a deal on the table. If he pled guilty, they dropped the charge from first-degree to second-degree murder. In the end, Christopher took the deal. He admitted that he approached Ardith on the bike path, dragged her into the woods with the intent to assault her, and then drowned her in the river. He also pled guilty to several other attacks on women. For all of this, he got a life sentence, but with the possibility of parole after just 10 years. That leniency was part of the plea deal, though it didn't mean he'd actually walk free. His first chance at parole came in 2015, but the board flat out denied it. 5 years later, in 2020, he tried again and was turned down once more. This time, experts made it clear, even after 15 years behind bars, he was still considered highly likely to reoffend. As of today, Christopher is still in prison, and it's unlikely he'll ever walk free. Ardith Wood's murder became one of the most infamous cases in Ottawa's history, leaving deep scars on the community. For years afterward, women were terrified to walk in parks or ride their bikes alone. Locals even organized volunteer patrols along the bike paths, groups of people riding together to watch over each other and prevent anything like this from happening again. And one last note, while Christopher admitted to several assaults, detectives were convinced he had committed many more. The issue was that not all of his victims ever saw his face, which made it impossible to tie him directly to every case. As for the Jennifer Teague case mentioned earlier in this story, you'll find the link to that video in the description. Share your thoughts on this story in the comments section, and don't forget to press the like button. A mother put her daughters to bed, but when she went to their room the next morning, one of the girls was missing. The police quickly joined the search, realizing she clearly hadn't left the house of her own accord. Despite uncovering some shocking clues, the search for the answers spanned years. Eventually, detectives managed to unravel the truth, and it was truly shocking. Kirsten Hatfield was born on February 12, 1989, in Midwest City, Oklahoma. The girl's father left the family right after her birth, leading their mother, Shannon, to move to her parents' house. They helped her raise the child, and when Kirsten turned 2, they moved to their own home. Later, Shannon got married again, and her second daughter, Faith, was born. This marriage also didn't last long. leaving the woman to raise her daughters alone. Despite her young age, Kirsten helped her mother take care of her younger sister. Thanks to this, she became very independent and got along pretty well with Faith. The girls shared a bedroom while their mother slept in the next one. On the evening of May 13, 1997, when Kirsten was 8 years old and her sister, 3, Shannon prepared the girls for sleep. Usually, she reads them a story, but this time, Faith had already fallen asleep and the woman didn't want to wake her. She wished her older daughter a good night and went to her bedroom, leaving the door to the girls' room slightly ajar. She did this every night in case either of the girls woke up and called her. Somewhere around 3 a.m., Shannon was awakened by a noise coming from her daughter's room. Thinking the girls had woken up, she went to their room. However, as soon as she reached the corridor and approached the door to their bedroom, the noise stopped. Assuming the girls had gone back to sleep, she decided not to wake them and was about to return to her room. But before she did, something strange caught her eye. The door to the girls' room was completely closed, although Shannon always left it slightly open. She thought one of the girls might have closed the door, or she herself had forgotten to leave it open. Shannon approached the door, opened it slightly, but didn't enter the room, then went back to sleep. The next morning, around 6:30 a.m., Shannon went to wake the girls. She entered their bedroom and found that only her younger daughter, Faith, was in bed. She woke her up and asked where Kirsten was, but Faith didn't know. The woman immediately began searching the entire house, but the girl was nowhere to be found. She looked outside, then called all of her friends whose children Kirsten was friends with. She hoped the girl had gone to one of them, but they all said they hadn't seen her. After that, Shannon called her father, who lived nearby. Her last hope was that the girl had gone to him, but he also hadn't seen her. Realizing that Kirsten had disappeared, he told Shannon to call the police and went to their house. So, the woman called 911, and officers arrived at the scene within a few minutes. Initially, they thought the girl might have been hiding somewhere in the house or had gone for a walk. In their quiet town, there had never been a case of a child being abducted from their own bedroom, so the local police had never encountered anything like it. However, soon the officers realized the situation was much more serious. Upon inspecting Kirsten's room, they found the window slightly ajar with a few drops of blood on the frame. The police went outside and began examining the area around the window. A few yards away, they discovered a piece of children's underwear on the ground stained with blood. The officers asked Shannon to confirm that it belonged to her daughter, and she recognized it. Investigators realized they were likely dealing with the kidnapping, and more officers were immediately called to the scene. When they searched the area behind and around the house, police questioned the girl's mother. She recounted waking up at 3 a.m. after hearing a noise. Suddenly, she realized that at that moment, an unknown criminal was likely abducting Kirsten. The search around the house yielded no results, and the police started interviewing all residents in the neighborhood. Unfortunately, none of them saw or heard anything suspicious that night. The only lead detectives could gather was that one of the neighbors was awakened by a dog barking around 3 a.m., coinciding with the time of the abduction. Failing to find any solid leads, investigators turned to a child psychologist to speak with Faith. Despite being only 3 years old, she shared that she had witnessed the abduction. However, she kept repeating only one phrase: "A bad person came and took my sister." This once again confirmed that the girl did not leave the house willingly, but it provided no further clues to identify the perpetrator or locate Kirsten. Detectives had to restart the investigation practically from scratch. Their initial suspicion leaned towards someone who knew Kirsten well, as it seemed unlikely that a stranger could abduct her from her own room without a sound. Working on this theory, police discovered that the girl's mother had a history of drug-related problems. The detectives considered the possibility that the abduction might be related to this. Perhaps the mother owed money to some people in the criminal underworld and they decided to take her daughter as payment. The alternative was even more chilling. The police did not rule out the mother willingly handing over her daughter. This would explain why the abduction happened almost silently. They spoke with Shannon, but she denied any involvement. She claimed to have been clean from illegal substances for a long period of time and insisted she would never give away her daughter. Detectives didn't rush to clear her of suspicions, but they couldn't find any evidence to support the mother's involvement. So, the police decided to seek the public's help, reaching out through the media, asking people to share any information related to the case. In the following days, the police department received hundreds of calls, and detectives diligently followed up on each lead. Most of them were quite superficial and lacked any valuable information. However, investigators soon stumbled upon some disturbing tip. A woman called in, suspecting her boyfriend of being involved in a kidnapping. He had been behaving aggressively, even stating during an argument that if she didn't obey him, he would do to her what he did to Kirsten Hatfield. As the police began investigating this man, they uncovered another alarming fact. He was acquainted with Shannon's brother, meaning Kirsten might have known him. Moreover, the girls and their mother lived in a house that previously belonged to her brother, leading the investigators to believe that the suspect might have been familiar with the layout. The man also had a history that brought him into the police's view, including involvement with drugs and even assault. Everything pointed to him possibly being connected to the crime. However, the man claimed he was at a bar that night. Police verified this information and numerous witnesses confirmed his alibi, placing him at the bar until around 4 a.m., eliminating the possibility of him abducting the girl. Following this, investigators pursued hundreds of other leads, but all of them led to dead ends. The case stretched over months, and with each passing day, hope of finding Kirsten alive dwindled. Her mother couldn't just wait and do nothing as the police repeatedly hit dead ends. From the early days, she tried everything in her power to locate her daughter. She gave interviews to the local media, distributed flyers, and even personally investigated various suspects. In her quest for the truth, Shannon faced numerous challenges. For instance, she came up with the idea of reaching out to local businesses in the county, asking them to put flyers about Kirsten in their offices, stores, and establishments. To her surprise, many refused, citing it contradicted company policies. She also attempted to secure a meeting with the state governor, but it was unsuccessful. Shannon also organized a small center with the goal of attracting volunteers to Kirsten's case. They mainly focused on distributing flyers and engaging with the media, but Shannon encountered new problems. Some volunteers stole money, others lied about the work done, and used the media to draw attention to themselves. Despite all of this, she never gave up trying to unravel the truth for many years. At one point, Shannon realized that the current approach wasn't yielding any results, prompting her to take a different path. She enrolled in college, earned a degree in criminology, and became a parole officer. Shannon chose this path not only to find her daughter's kidnapper, but also to protect others from criminals who might be released from prison and still pose a threat. She strongly believed that the person who took Kirsten had other criminal convictions. In her detailed study of individuals with violent pasts in her town and surrounding areas, she attempted to find any connection to her daughter's abduction. However, in the end, all of these efforts yielded no results. At this point, Shannon resigned herself to the likelihood that Kirsten was probably no longer alive and she would never be able to bring her back. Nevertheless, she never abandoned her quest for answers completely. The police occasionally reopened the case, examining new leads, but it yielded no results. In collaboration with the FBI, they even created a sketch of what Kirsten might look like years after the abduction. No one believed she was still alive, yet without her remains, they couldn't declare this with absolute certainty. The stagnation in the case lasted for many years until an unexpected turn of events. In 2014, a woman called the police with a rather bizarre story. Her grandmother had recently passed away, and as she sorted through the remaining belongings, she found a diary. In it, the grandmother detailed how her own son had confessed to killing Kirsten Hatfield. The narrative contained such a wealth of details that detectives had no doubt about the authenticity of the information. According to the diary, the man abducted Kirsten from her bedroom and took her to a nearby town where he owned a house. There, he subjected her to heinous acts and brutally murdered her. The description of the entire process spanned several pages, leaving even seasoned investigators horrified. Furthermore, the diary mentioned that the entire ordeal was recorded on videocassette. Detectives immediately brought in the woman's son for questioning. While they anticipated him denying everything, his words surprised them even more. He claimed no involvement in the crime, but knew who committed it because the girl was killed in his ex-girlfriend's house. This perplexed the police, prompting them to ask the man for the address of this house. Detectives swiftly obtained a warrant and sent in a team to thoroughly examine the property. Their first step involved spraying luminol, a substance that emits a glow upon contact with even the tiniest traces of blood, even if it had been cleaned from the scene of the crime. When the forensic experts did this, they were met with genuine shock. One of them later stated that the entire house lit up like a Christmas tree. The chemical revealed that blood was practically everywhere, and most importantly, the blood-stained patterns matched the gruesome details of the murder described in the diary. Experts removed floorboards, cut out sections of wallpaper, and sent out everything to the lab. They also assembled a team for excavations on the property, hoping to find the girl's body. In addition, the police found a box in the house containing hundreds of videocassettes, prompting them to recall the diary. They knew that one of these tapes should contain footage of the victim being abused. Detectives meticulously reviewed each tape, a process that took countless hours. However, none of the cassettes contained anything relating to the murder. The excavations also yielded no results. There were no remains or any evidence in the soil on the property. But then, the detectives faced the most unexpected twist. Experts analyzing the remains of the bloodstains in the house concluded that the blood belonged to an animal, not a human. This came as an absolute shock to the police, as they were convinced they were finally on the verge of solving Kirsten's case. Instead, investigators faced yet another false lead. What this was exactly remains unknown. Perhaps someone decided to play a cruel joke on the police, or the diary was penned by an individual with mental health issues who saw information about the girl's abduction on the news and believed in a narrative being born in their minds. Nevertheless, detectives continued to hope that sooner or later, they would uncover the truth. However, no new leads emerged, and the case once again came to a standstill. In the summer of 2015, Kirsten's case was handed over to a new detective named Daryl Miller, who decided to initiate a fresh investigation. He studied all the existing documents and records, and at some point he noticed something peculiar. To his surprise, Miller realized that over all these years, his predecessors hadn't examined the crucial pieces of evidence: the blood on the windowsill in the victim's room, and on her underwear. Although these pieces of evidence were stored in the warehouse for some inexplicable reason, they hadn't been sent to the lab for analysis. Perhaps, back then, the police thought the blood belonged to the girl and analyzing it wouldn't yield any results. Miller decided to rectify this and sent the evidence to the lab. Soon, they called him back, stating that both blood samples belonged not to Kirsten, but to an unknown male. This was a long-awaited breakthrough, but the detective faced a new challenge. The abductor's DNA sample was immediately uploaded to the FBI database, but there was no match. This could mean that he hadn't committed serious crimes, or it happened before the database's creation. Nevertheless, Miller was undeterred. He decided to collect DNA samples from all the men involved in the case since the abduction. The police compiled a list, located each person, and sent their DNA to the lab. Surprisingly, every individual willingly provided their samples right away. This led investigators to consider that the murderer might have not been part of the case files. Despite this, Miller patiently awaited the results until he finally got a call from the lab. Experts had completed the analysis of one of the samples and found that it perfectly matched the blood found on the victim's windowsill and underwear. The individual was 56-year-old Anthony Palma, a neighbor of the Hatfield family who lived just across the street from them. Palma was one of the first people the police spoke to on the day of the abduction. Back then, he told them he woke up around 3 a.m. due to his dog barking. Now, with confirmation of his involvement, detectives decided to speak with him again. While DNA evidence was more than sufficient for a conviction in court, investigators hoped to extract a confession. Firstly, it would significantly expedite the trial, and secondly, only he knew where Kirsten's body was, making it nearly impossible to locate her remains without his cooperation. Detectives chose to proceed cautiously. They invited Anthony for questioning, stating it was a routine process. Supposedly, they were re-interviewing everyone, including neighbors, hoping to gather some new information. In reality, they had a specific task to get him to admit whether he had ever been inside the Hatfield family home. Initially, detectives asked if he remembered anything else from that night. Anthony recounted the same story as 18 years ago. However, this time he added a new detail. He allegedly saw a white car parked in front of Kirsten's house, but didn't think much of it. Next, the police inquired about his familiarity with the girl and her family. Anthony said he knew them as neighbors but never interacted with Kirsten personally. He added that during those years, he got along well with other neighborhood kids. For instance, they occasionally asked him to fix their bikes or stop by for candy. Subsequently, the police asked if he had ever been inside Kirsten's house. Perhaps the girl's mother had asked him for help, or he had visited just to chat. However, Anthony claimed he had never been inside the house while the family lived there. For the detectives, this became a crucial moment for the interrogation. Considering the man's blood was found on the windowsill from the victim's room, they had just caught him in a lie. Thanks to this, in court, he wouldn't be able to claim that the blood got there under different circumstances, like when he visited the neighbors on another day. However, there was a problem. The house where Kirsten lived had previously belonged to Anthony's friend, and he admitted to visiting it during those years. But the blood sample on the windowsill was clearly fresh and couldn't have been left there many years ago. However, detectives decided to move on to the main part and informed him that his blood was found in Kirsten's room and on her underwear. Anthony began denying this, repeating that he had never been inside their home. Investigators tried to extract a confession, but he consistently stuck to his denial. Then they opted to change tactics and left the room. Detective Miller entered to speak with Anthony. He brought along a photo of Kirsten, placing it on the table in front of the suspect. Anthony immediately pushed it away and avoided looking at the photo for the rest of the conversation. Miller asked him various questions, hoping Anthony would eventually slip up, but he continued to deny everything. Realizing they wouldn't extract a confession, the police decided to finish the interrogation and arrested the man. Following this, they obtained a search warrant for his house, thoroughly excavated the entire area, but couldn't find any trace of the girl's remains or any other evidence. During the trial, Anthony persisted in denying his involvement, but the results of the DNA analysis spoke for themselves. In court, additional details emerged that police had overlooked during the initial investigation. It turned out Anthony had prior run-ins with the law. Several years before Kirsten's abduction, he had intruded into another girl's bedroom and assaulted her. He had also been imprisoned in the 80s for a weapon-related attack. This further underscored Anthony's status as a dangerous criminal, but for some reason, his past convictions were overlooked in 1997. In late 2017, the jury found him guilty of Kirsten's abduction and murder, sentencing Anthony to life in prison. Throughout the trial, he never revealed the location of her remains, and the police doubt they'll ever find the girl. The problem lies in Anthony's employment with the park services. Familiar with remote areas, he could have buried the body where investigators might never reach. Nevertheless, the victim's mother persisted in trying to find her daughter. She regularly called Anthony and visited him in prison, spending hours seeking answers. With each interaction, she felt the criminal was getting closer to disclosing the body's whereabouts, but it never happened. In early 2019, Anthony was killed by his cellmate, driven by personal animosity stemming from Anthony's crime against the child. As a result, the Kirsten family's sole hope to locate the girl's body rests on the chance that hunters or travelers may stumble upon it in remote national parks. Callum Thorne and Evelyn Russo were the epitome of young love. Both 20 years old, they seemed destined for each other from the moment they met. Callum, with his boyish charm and ambitious spirit, had just started his own landscaping business. His rugged good looks and kind heart made him popular among the locals, but he had eyes for only one person. Evelyn, on the other hand, was a vision of grace and beauty. With flowing hair and piercing eyes, she turned heads wherever she went. A talented artist, she dreamed of opening her own gallery one day. Her creativity and passion for life were infectious, drawing people to her like moths to a flame. Their paths crossed on a crisp autumn evening at the annual Millbrook Harvest Festival. Callum was volunteering at the pumpkin carving station, his strong hands skillfully guiding children as they created their masterpieces. Evelyn, manning the face-painting booth, couldn't help but notice the gentle giant with the infectious laugh. As fate would have it, they found themselves cleaning up side by side as the festival wound down. Their conversation flowed effortlessly, punctuated by shy glances and nervous laughter. By the end of the night, they had exchanged numbers and made plans to meet for coffee the following week. From that moment on, Callum and Evelyn were inseparable. Their relationship blossomed at a dizzying pace, fueled by the intensity of young love and the excitement of finding a kindred spirit. They spent their days exploring the hidden gems of Millbrook, from secluded hiking trails to quaint cafes tucked away in corners of the town. Evenings were filled with long conversations about their hopes and dreams. Callum spoke passionately about expanding his business, while Evelyn shared her sketches and paintings, her eyes lighting up as she described the emotions behind each piece. They supported each other's ambitions wholeheartedly, each believing they had found their perfect match. Their families and friends marveled at the strength of their connection. It was as if they had known each other for years rather than months. Evelyn's parents, Thomas and Maria Russo, welcomed Callum with open arms, seeing in him the son they never had. Callum's widowed mother, Fiona Thorne, was equally enamored with Evelyn, grateful that her son had found someone who brought such joy to his life. As winter turned to spring, their love only grew stronger. They began making plans for the future, talking about where they might live, how many children they wanted, and the adventures they would embark on together. It seemed that nothing could dampen their enthusiasm for the life they were building. On a warm evening in May, just 6 months after they had met, Callum got down on one knee in the very spot where they had first talked at the Harvest Festival. With tears in his eyes, he asked Evelyn to be his wife. Without hesitation, she said yes, sealing their commitment with a kiss that held the promise of forever. Little did they know that their fairy tale was about to take a dark turn, one that would test the very foundations of their love and trust in ways they could never have imagined. The news of Callum and Evelyn's engagement spread through Millbrook like wildfire. The town buzzed with excitement, eager to celebrate the union of two of its most beloved young residents. The couple wasted no time in diving headfirst into wedding planning, their enthusiasm palpable as they discussed every detail of their special day. Evelyn threw herself into the preparations with gusto. She spent hours poring over bridal magazines, creating mood boards, and visiting venues. Her artistic eye came in handy as she meticulously coordinated color schemes and floral arrangements. Callum, while less interested in the finer details, was happy to support Evelyn's vision, offering input when asked and ensuring that his bride-to-be had everything she desired. As the weeks passed, however, subtle changes began to creep into their relationship. Evelyn, once so open and affectionate, started to become distant and preoccupied. She would spend long hours on her phone, quickly locking the screen whenever Callum entered the room. Her explanations of wedding-related calls and messages rang hollow, leaving Callum with a nagging sense of unease. Their once frequent date nights became increasingly rare, with Evelyn citing wedding stress and the need to finalize details as reasons for canceling plans. When they did spend time together, she seemed distracted, her mind clearly elsewhere. Callum tried to brush off his concerns, attributing her behavior to pre-wedding jitters and the pressure of planning such a significant event. Friends and family noticed the shift as well. Evelyn's best friend Zoe remarked on how Evelyn no longer gushed about Callum the way she used to. Callum's mother Fiona sensed a tension between the couple that hadn't been there before. She gently probed her son, asking if everything was all right. But Callum brushed off her concerns with a forced smile and reassurances that all was well. As the wedding day drew nearer, Callum's doubts grew stronger. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. Late one night, as Evelyn slept soundly beside him, he found himself staring at the ceiling, a knot of anxiety tightening in his chest. He loved Evelyn with all his heart, but a voice in the back of his mind whispered that perhaps she no longer felt the same way. Little did Callum know that his instincts were right on the mark. The woman lying next to him, the one he had chosen to spend his life with, was harboring a secret that would soon shatter their world and set in motion a chain of events that would end in tragedy. As Callum grappled with his growing doubts, a new figure entered the scene, one who would play a pivotal role in the unfolding drama. Garrett Blackwood, a renowned wedding photographer, came highly recommended by several of Millbrook's elite families. At 50 years old, Garrett exuded a magnetic charm that belied his age. His salt and pepper hair and piercing eyes gave him a distinguished appearance, while his quick wit and smooth demeanor made him instantly likable. Garrett had made a name for himself, capturing the most intimate moments of couples' special days. His portfolio was impressive, featuring stunning shots that seemed to capture not just images, but emotions. When Evelyn stumbled upon his work online, she was immediately captivated. She convinced Callum that Garrett was the only choice for their wedding photographer, insisting that his artistic vision aligned perfectly with her own. Their first meeting with Garrett took place at a trendy cafe in downtown Millbrook. From the moment he walked in, his presence commanded attention. He greeted the couple with a warm smile and a firm handshake, his eyes lingering on Evelyn a fraction longer than necessary. As they discussed the wedding plans, Garrett's focus seemed to be primarily on the bride-to-be, hanging on her every word and offering enthusiastic praise for her ideas. Callum, initially impressed by Garrett's portfolio and professionalism, found himself feeling increasingly uncomfortable as the meeting progressed. He couldn't quite put his finger on why, but something about the way Garrett interacted with Evelyn set him on edge. He brushed it off as artistic camaraderie, trying to convince himself that he was reading too much into innocent interactions. As they left the cafe, Evelyn couldn't stop talking about how perfect Garrett was for their wedding. She gushed about his vision, his talent, and how lucky they were to have secured his services. Callum nodded along, pushing down the twinge of jealousy that threatened to surface. In the weeks that followed, Garrett became a frequent presence in their lives. He insisted on multiple meetings to discuss shot lists, lighting, and locations. Each time, Evelyn seemed to grow more animated and excited about the photography aspect of the wedding. She began to suggest additional photo sessions, including an engagement shoot and a boudoir session as a surprise for Callum. Garrett's charm extended beyond the couple. At a pre-wedding dinner with both families, he regaled everyone with tales of his travels and the celebrities he had photographed. Evelyn's parents were particularly taken with him, praising his sophistication and worldliness. Even Callum's mother, Fiona, found herself warming to Garrett's charismatic personality. As the wedding day approached, Garrett's influence on the proceedings grew. He suggested changes to the venue layout to optimize lighting, advised on the timing of events to capture the best moments, and even offered input on Evelyn's choice of dress. With each suggestion, Evelyn became more enthralled, while Callum felt increasingly sidelined in his own wedding plans. Little did anyone know that behind Garrett's professional facade and charming smile lurked a man with his own agenda, one that would soon threaten to destroy not just a wedding, but lives. The spark that ignited the affair between Evelyn and Garrett was as unexpected as it was intense. It happened during a routine meeting to discuss the wedding photo locations. Callum, tied up with an emergency at work, couldn't make it, leaving Evelyn to meet Garrett alone at a picturesque spot by Millbrook Lake. As they walked along the shore, scouting for the perfect backdrop, their conversation drifted from wedding plans to more personal topics. Garrett, with his worldly experience and smooth talking, captivated Evelyn. He spoke of his travels, the art he had seen, and the life he had lived, all things that resonated deeply with Evelyn's artistic soul, and her dreams of a life beyond Millbrook. In a moment of vulnerability, Evelyn confessed her fears about settling down so young, her doubts about whether she was truly ready for marriage. Garrett listened intently, offering understanding and empathy. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the lake, Garrett gently tucked a strand of hair behind Evelyn's ear. The touch, innocent as it seemed, sent a jolt of electricity through both of them. Their eyes met, and in that instant, a line was crossed. The kiss that followed was passionate and forbidden, awakening feelings in Evelyn that she had never experienced before. When they finally broke apart, breathless and guilty, they knew that everything had changed. The affair escalated quickly from there. Evelyn and Garrett began meeting in secret, using the pretense of wedding preparations to steal moments alone. They would rendezvous at out-of-town cafes, secluded spots in the nearby forest, and even in Garrett's studio under the guise of planning the boudoir shoot. Each encounter left Evelyn feeling more alive and conflicted. The passion she felt with Garrett was intoxicating, unlike anything she had experienced with Callum. Garrett made her feel sophisticated, understood, and desired in a way that thrilled and terrified her in equal measure. For Garrett, Evelyn represented a chance to recapture his youth. Her beauty, innocence, and enthusiasm reminded him of the women he had loved and lost in his younger days. He knew the affair was wrong, that he was potentially destroying a young couple's future. But he couldn't bring himself to end it. As the affair deepened, Evelyn found herself pulling away from Callum. She made excuses to avoid intimacy, claiming stress and exhaustion from wedding planning. When they were together, her mind was often elsewhere, replaying moments with Garrett or planning their next clandestine meeting. Callum, sensing the growing distance between them, tried desperately to reconnect. He planned surprise dates, wrote her love notes, and even suggested they take a break from wedding planning to focus on their relationship. But Evelyn, consumed by her secret passion, found herself unable to reciprocate his efforts fully. The guilt ate away at Evelyn. There were moments when she considered confessing everything to Callum, moments when she resolved to end things with Garrett. But each time she saw Garrett, all her resolve crumbled. The thrill of their forbidden romance was too strong to resist. As the wedding day drew nearer, the stakes grew higher. Evelyn knew she had to make a decision, but found herself paralyzed by indecision. She loved Callum, or at least she thought she did. But the passion she felt for Garrett was undeniable. The idea of walking down the aisle to Callum while harboring these secrets filled her with dread. Garrett, for his part, began to pressure Evelyn to call off the wedding. He painted pictures of the life they could have together, traveling the world, pursuing their artistic passions, living a life free from the constraints of small-town expectations. His words were a siren song to Evelyn, tempting her with a future that seemed both thrilling and terrifying. As the days ticked down to the wedding, the tension mounted. Evelyn knew that soon, she would have to face the consequences of her actions. Little did she know that fate, and Callum, had other plans. As Evelyn became more deeply entangled in her affair with Garrett, Callum's initial doubts blossomed into full-fledged suspicion. The changes in Evelyn were too significant to ignore: her emotional distance, her constant preoccupation with her phone, and the way she seemed to light up whenever Garrett's name was mentioned. Determined to understand what was happening, Callum tried to communicate with Evelyn. He initiated conversations about their relationship, asking if she was having second thoughts about the wedding. Evelyn's responses were always the same: reassurances that she was just stressed about the wedding preparations and that everything was fine. But her words rang hollow, lacking the sincerity and warmth that had once characterized their interactions. Unsatisfied with Evelyn's explanations, Callum began to pay closer attention to her behavior. He noticed how she would abruptly end phone calls when he entered the room, the way her eyes would dart nervously when asked about her whereabouts, and the increasing frequency of her meetings with Garrett. One evening, as they lay in bed, Callum reached out to hold Evelyn, only to have her flinch away from his touch. The pain of that reflexive rejection was a turning point for Callum. He knew then that he couldn't ignore his instincts any longer. Reluctantly, Callum began to gather evidence. He felt ashamed of his actions, but the need to know the truth overrode his guilt. He started by checking Evelyn's phone records, noting the frequent calls and texts to a number he didn't recognize. He drove by Garrett's studio at odd hours, his heart sinking when he saw Evelyn's car parked outside, long after their scheduled meeting should have ended. The final piece of evidence came in the form of a forgotten receipt. While doing laundry, Callum found a crumpled paper in Evelyn's jacket pocket, a bill from a hotel in the next town over. The date coincided with a day Evelyn had claimed to be visiting her cousin. As the reality of Evelyn's betrayal sank in, Callum was overwhelmed with a mixture of anger, hurt, and disbelief. The woman he loved, the one he had planned to spend his life with, had been lying to him for months. The future he had envisioned, their home, their family, their shared dreams, seemed to crumble before his eyes. Torn between confronting Evelyn and gathering more evidence, Callum found himself at a crossroads. Should he call off the wedding based on his suspicions? Confront Evelyn and demand the truth? Or wait and see if she would come clean on her own? As the wedding day loomed ever closer, Callum knew he had to make a decision. Little did he know that the choice he would make would set in motion a series of events that would change everyone's lives forever. The night before the wedding, Callum found himself unable to sleep, his mind racing with doubts and suspicions. As dawn broke, he made a fateful decision. He needed to know the truth, once and for all, before he stood at the altar. With shaking hands, he picked up Evelyn's phone from the nightstand. She had always guarded it closely, but in her exhausted state the night before, she had forgotten to set the passcode. Guilt gnawed at him as he opened her messages, but the need for answers overpowered his moral hesitation. What he found shattered his world. Messages between Evelyn and Garrett filled the screen, leaving no doubt about the nature of their relationship. Intimate photos, declarations of love, and plans for their future together after the wedding was called off. It was all there in black and white. Callum's hands trembled as he scrolled through months of deception. He read about secret rendezvous, passionate encounters, and worst of all, Evelyn's doubts about marrying him. In one particularly painful exchange, Evelyn had written to Garrett, "I love you in a way I never loved Callum. You make me feel alive." As the full extent of the betrayal sank in, Callum felt a wave of nausea wash over him. He stumbled to the bathroom, barely making it before he emptied the contents of his stomach. The sound of his retching woke Evelyn, who called out to him in concern. Gathering himself, Callum returned to the bedroom. Evelyn sat up in bed, her face etched with worry as she took in his pale complexion and red-rimmed eyes. She asked what was wrong, reaching out to touch his arm. Callum recoiled from her touch as if burned. In that moment, looking at the woman he had loved and trusted, Callum felt a surge of anger unlike anything he had ever experienced. He held up her phone, his voice low and dangerous as he asked, "How long?" Evelyn's face drained of color as she realized what had happened. She started to speak, to offer explanations and excuses, but Callum cut her off. He didn't want to hear it. The evidence was irrefutable. As the reality of the situation sank in, Evelyn broke down in tears, begging Callum to understand, to forgive her. She claimed she had been confused, that she still loved him, but her words fell on deaf ears. Callum's mind was already racing ahead, thinking of the guests who would soon be arriving, the families who had traveled for the wedding, the life they had planned together, all of it built on a foundation of lies. In that moment, something shifted in Callum. The hurt and betrayal crystallized into a cold, hard resolve. He looked at Evelyn, the woman he had thought would be his wife, and made a decision that would alter the course of all their lives. "The wedding will go on," he said, his voice devoid of emotion, "but not the way you think." With those cryptic words, Callum left the room, leaving a stunned and tearful Evelyn behind. As he closed the door, he knew that the events he was about to set in motion would have consequences beyond anything he could imagine. The morning of the wedding dawned bright and clear, a stark contrast to the emotional turmoil brewing beneath the surface. The Millbrook Community Church, a picturesque white building with a tall steeple, was adorned with flowers and ribbons. Guests began to arrive, dressed in their finest, unaware of the drama unfolding behind the scenes. In the groom's room, Callum sat alone, staring at his reflection in the mirror. Dark circles under his eyes betrayed his sleepless night, but his face was set in grim determination. His best man, Liam, entered the room, ready with jokes to calm pre-wedding jitters. He faltered when he saw Callum's expression, sensing that something was terribly wrong. Callum brushed off Liam's concerns, insisting that everything was fine. But as he mechanically went through the motions of getting ready, his mind was racing, replaying the shocking discoveries of the previous night and finalizing the plan he had formulated in the dark hours of the morning. Meanwhile, in the bridal suite, Evelyn was a bundle of nerves. Her bridesmaids fluttered around her, adjusting her gown and veil, oblivious to the real reason for her distress. Evelyn's eyes were red and puffy, which everyone attributed to emotional anticipation of the big day. Only she knew the truth, that her tears were born of guilt, fear, and confusion. As she was helped into her wedding dress, Evelyn's phone buzzed with a message. It was from Garrett, wishing her luck and expressing his love. The message only intensified her inner turmoil. She had spent the night torn between her feelings for Garrett and her commitment to Callum, unsure of how to proceed. Outside, guests continued to arrive. Callum's mother, Fiona, greeted people with a strained smile, unable to shake off the feeling that something was amiss with her son. Evelyn's parents, Thomas and Maria, beamed with pride, blissfully unaware of the storm about to break. Garrett arrived, camera in hand, ready to capture the day's events. His professional demeanor was in place, but those who looked closely might have noticed the tension in his jaw, the way his eyes darted around nervously. As the ceremony's start time approached, a palpable tension began to build. The wedding planner, sensing that something was off, tried to coordinate with both bride and groom, but found herself stonewalled at every turn. Guests took their seats in the church, an excited murmur filling the air. The organist began to play, signaling the start of the ceremony. Callum stood at the altar, his face an unreadable mask. The groomsmen exchanged worried glances, picking up on his unusual demeanor. The bridesmaids began their procession down the aisle, each step bringing the moment of truth closer. As the bridal march began to play, all eyes turned to the back of the church, expecting to see a radiant Evelyn. But Evelyn hesitated at the church doors, her father at her side. She felt as if she was standing on the edge of a precipice, knowing that once she took that first step down the aisle, there would be no turning back. Her father, mistaking her reluctance for normal nerves, gave her hand a reassuring squeeze. With a deep breath, Evelyn began her walk down the aisle. Each step felt like an eternity as she approached Callum. Their eyes met, and in that moment, she knew that he knew everything. The look in his eyes, a mixture of hurt, anger, and something else she couldn't quite identify, sent a chill down her spine. As Evelyn reached the altar and took her place beside Callum, the officiant began to speak. But before he could get more than a few words out, Callum raised his hand, silencing him. A hush fell over the church as all eyes turned to the groom, waiting to see what would happen next. The silence in the church was deafening as Callum turned to face the assembled guests. His voice, when he spoke, was calm, but carried to every corner of the building. "Friends, family, I want to thank you all for coming today," he began, his words measured and deliberate. "You're here to witness a union, a commitment of love and trust. But before we proceed, there's something you all need to know." Evelyn, standing beside him, felt her heart racing. She reached out to touch Callum's arm to stop him, but he shrugged off her hand without even looking at her. "For the past few months," Callum continued, his voice gaining strength, "the woman I thought I would spend my life with has been living a lie. She's been having an affair." A collective gasp rippled through the church. Evelyn's parents, seated in the front row, looked on in shock and disbelief. Fiona Thorne covered her mouth with her hand, her eyes wide with horror. "And not just with anyone," Callum went on, his gaze sweeping the crowd until it landed on Garrett, who stood frozen near the back of the church, camera forgotten in his hands. "With our wedding photographer, Garrett Blackwood." The reaction was immediate and chaotic. Guests turned in their seats, craning their necks to look at Garrett. Murmurs of shock and disgust filled the air. Evelyn's mother let out a strangled cry, while her father's face turned an alarming shade of red. Evelyn, her face ashen, tried to speak, but no words came out. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she looked frantically between Callum and the stunned congregation. Garrett, for his part, seemed to shrink under the collective gaze of the wedding guests. He took a step back, as if contemplating fleeing, but found his exit blocked by outraged attendees. "I discovered their betrayal last night," Callum continued, his voice now trembling with awe. With these words, Callum reached into his jacket and pulled out a stack of papers, printouts of messages and photos he had discovered on Evelyn's phone. He began to read aloud, his voice carrying clearly through the shocked silence of the church, laying bare every sordid detail of the affair. As Callum's revelations continued, the atmosphere in the church shifted from shock to anger. The day that was meant to celebrate love had turned into a public humiliation, and the tension in the air was palpable, ready to ignite at the slightest spark. As Callum's words hung in the air, the church erupted into chaos. Shouts of anger and disbelief filled the sacred space, drowning out the sobs of Evelyn and the protestations of Garrett. Evelyn's father, Thomas Russo, was the first to act. He lunged towards Garrett, his face contorted with rage. "You bastard," he roared, his fist connecting with Garrett's jaw in a sickening crunch. Garrett stumbled backward, crashing into a row of pews. The violent outburst seemed to break a dam, and suddenly the church was a sea of motion. Guests surged forward, some trying to restrain Thomas, others joining in his attack on Garrett. Women screamed, children cried, and the air was thick with the sound of shattering glass as vases and decorations were knocked over in the melee. Evelyn, still at the altar, collapsed to her knees, her pristine white dress pooling around her. She reached out towards Callum, begging him to stop, to take it all back. But Callum stood impassive, watching the chaos unfold with a detached expression. In the midst of the pandemonium, Garrett managed to break free from his attackers. Blooded and disoriented, he stumbled towards the exit. Evelyn, seeing him trying to escape, suddenly found her feet. In a moment of panic and desperation, she hitched up her dress and ran after him, pushing past shocked guests. Callum, seeing Evelyn flee, felt something snap inside him. The cold detachment that had sustained him through his revelation gave way to a white-hot rage. Without thinking, he took off in pursuit, shouldering past his best man who tried to hold him back. Outside the church, the bright sunlight was jarring after the dimness inside. Garrett had made it to his car and was fumbling with his keys when Evelyn caught up to him. She grabbed his arm, pleading with him, though for what she wasn't sure, to take her with him, to stay and face the consequences. Before Garrett could respond, Callum burst out of the church. The sight of Evelyn with Garrett, still in her wedding dress, was the final straw. With a roar of anguish and fury, Callum charged towards them. What happened next occurred so quickly that later, witnesses would give conflicting accounts. There was a scuffle, shouts, and then the sharp retort of a gunshot that cut through the air like a thunderclap. For a moment, everything went still. Then, Evelyn screamed, a sound of pure horror that would haunt those who heard it for years to come. As she crumpled to the ground, cradling Callum's motionless body, the full tragedy of the day became horrifyingly clear. The gunshot that rang out in front of Millbrook Community Church marked the violent end of what should have been a day of celebration. As the echo faded, it left in its wake a scene of unimaginable tragedy. Callum Thorne lay motionless on the ground, blood seeping through his crisp white shirt, staining it a deep crimson. Evelyn knelt beside him, her wedding dress now smeared with dirt and blood, her anguished cries piercing the air. Garrett Blackwood stood frozen, the smoking gun still in his hand, his face a mask of shock and disbelief. Within minutes, the quiet street was filled with the wail of sirens as police and paramedics rushed to the scene. Despite their best efforts, Callum was pronounced dead at the scene, the bullet having struck him directly in the heart. Garrett offered no resistance as he was handcuffed and led away, his eyes vacant, still struggling to comprehend what he had done. Evelyn, in a state of hysteria, had to be sedated before she could be moved from Callum's side. Garrett Blackwood was eventually convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to 25 years in prison. Evelyn Russo, though not charged with any crime, faced the harsh judgment of the community and her own conscience. She eventually left Millbrook, unable to bear the weight of the memories and the accusing glances of her neighbors. Everett Blackwood, a successful 38-year-old financial advisor, was known for his charming smile and his ability to put clients at ease. His wife, Imogen, 35, balanced her role as a part-time yoga instructor with being a devoted mother. To their neighbors and friends, the Blackwoods epitomized the perfect family. But as with many picture-perfect facades, cracks began to form beneath the surface. The pressure to maintain their image of familial harmony had started to take its toll. Everett's long hours at the office and frequent business trips created a growing distance between him and Imogen. Meanwhile, Imogen found herself increasingly overwhelmed by the demands of motherhood and her part-time career. As summer approached, the Blackwoods faced a new challenge. Imogen's yoga classes were becoming more popular, and she was offered the opportunity to lead a teacher training program. The couple realized they needed help with childcare to maintain their busy schedules and keep their family life running smoothly. Little did they know that their decision to hire a babysitter would set in motion a chain of events that would shatter their seemingly perfect world and leave their community reeling in shock. Daisy Summers was not what one would typically expect of a seasoned babysitter. At 18, she was a recent high school graduate with dreams of becoming a renowned photographer. Her portfolio was filled with moody black and white portraits and vibrant street scenes that hinted at a talent beyond her years. Born to working-class parents in the neighboring town of Mill Creek, Daisy had always felt like an outsider among her peers. Her artistic sensibilities and quiet demeanor set her apart from the sports-obsessed culture of her high school. She saw babysitting as a means to an end, a way to save money for her planned gap year in Europe before starting art school. Daisy's aunt, who lived in Oak Ridge Heights, had mentioned to Imogen that her niece was looking for summer work. Intrigued by the idea of having a creative influence around her children, Imogen invited Daisy for an interview. From the moment Daisy stepped into the Blackwood home, there was a subtle shift in the atmosphere. Her long hair fell in waves around her heart-shaped face, and her deep eyes seemed to take in every detail of her surroundings. Everett, who happened to be working from home that day, found himself strangely drawn to the young woman's presence. During the interview, Daisy's quiet confidence and genuine interest in the children impressed Imogen. She spoke of her love for art and how she hoped to incorporate creative activities into her time with Phoebe and Jasper. Imogen was sold, and Daisy was hired on the spot. The first few weeks seemed to go smoothly. Daisy quickly became a favorite with the children, who were enchanted by her storytelling and art projects. Imogen relished the freedom to focus on her yoga career, knowing her kids were in capable hands. Everett, too, seemed more relaxed. He started coming home earlier, often timing his arrival to coincide with Daisy's presence. He would engage her in conversations about her photography, showing a level of interest that he rarely displayed towards Imogen's pursuits. At first, Imogen was pleased to see her husband taking an interest in their babysitter's life. She even encouraged Daisy to show Everett her portfolio, hoping his business connections might prove useful for the young artist's future. But as the summer wore on, subtle changes began to occur. Lingering glances, an increasing number of accidental encounters, and a growing tension in the air when Everett and Daisy were in the same room. Slowly, imperceptibly, the dynamics within the Blackwood household began to shift, setting the stage for a tragedy that would soon unfold. As July turned to August, Imogen Blackwood found herself increasingly uneasy in her own home. At first, she couldn't quite put her finger on what was bothering her. Everything seemed to be running smoothly. The children were happy, her yoga classes were thriving, and Everett appeared more engaged with family life than he had been in months. Yet, there was something in the air, a tension that she couldn't shake. It started with small observations. Everett lingering in the kitchen when Daisy was preparing snacks for the kids, or the way his eyes would follow the young babysitter as she moved around the house. Imogen tried to dismiss these thoughts, attributing them to her own insecurities. After all, Everett had always been a flirt, and his charm was part of what had attracted her to him in the first place. But as the days passed, she couldn't help but notice more. There was the time she came home early from a yoga class to find Everett and Daisy in deep conversation, their heads close together as they looked at something on Daisy's phone. They had sprung apart when Imogen entered, Daisy mumbling something about showing Everett her latest photographs. Then there were the changes in Everett himself. He had started paying more attention to his appearance, wearing cologne even on weekends and buying new clothes. When Imogen complimented him, he brushed it off, saying he just felt like a change. One evening, as they were getting ready for bed, Imogen casually mentioned that Daisy had seemed distracted lately. Everett's response was oddly defensive, quickly changing the subject to his upcoming business trip. The seed of doubt, once planted, began to grow. Imogen found herself paying closer attention to the interactions between her husband and the babysitter. She noticed how Daisy's cheeks would flush when Everett entered a room, the way her laugh seemed to linger a bit too long at his jokes. She saw how Everett would find excuses to be home when Daisy was there, claiming he needed to pick up documents or had forgotten his laptop. As her suspicions grew, Imogen's behavior began to change. She became more irritable with the children, snapping at them for small infractions. Her yoga students noticed a shift in her teaching style, commenting on her lack of focus and shortened meditation sessions. At night, Imogen lay awake, her mind racing with possibilities. Was she imagining things? Was she letting her own insecurities poison her marriage? Or was there really something going on between Everett and Daisy? She tried to rationalize her thoughts. Daisy was barely out of high school, and Everett was a responsible father and respected professional. Surely, he wouldn't risk everything for a fling with a teenager. And yet, the doubts persisted. Imogen considered confronting Everett, but feared what his reaction might reveal. Instead, she began to watch and wait, gathering mental notes of every interaction, every glance, every moment that seemed out of place. The weight of her suspicions pressed down on her, transforming the once peaceful Blackwood home into a pressure cooker of unspoken tensions and simmering emotions. Little did Imogen know that her worst fears were about to be confirmed, setting in motion a chain of events that would lead to an unthinkable tragedy. As summer reached its peak, the connection between Everett Blackwood and Daisy Summers deepened, fueled by stolen moments and shared secrets. For Everett, Daisy represented a breath of fresh air in his carefully controlled life. Her youthful energy and artistic passion awakened something in him that he thought had long been dormant. It began innocently enough. Everett would arrive home early, ostensibly to spend time with his children, but increasingly, he found himself engaging Daisy in conversation. They would discuss her photography, her dreams of traveling the world, and her unique perspective on life. Everett found himself captivated by her views, so different from the pragmatic world of finance he inhabited. Daisy, for her part, was drawn to Everett's worldliness and success. He represented everything she aspired to: confidence, financial security, and a life beyond the confines of her small-town upbringing. When he spoke about his work or his travels, she hung on every word, imagining herself in the glamorous world he described. Their conversations grew longer and more intimate. Everett began sharing his own unfulfilled dreams, of writing a novel, of leaving the corporate world behind. Daisy listened with rapt attention, offering encouragement and understanding that he felt had been lacking in his marriage. As their emotional connection deepened, physical tension began to build. Accidental touches lingered a moment too long. Eye contact became charged with unspoken desire. They found excuses to be in the same room, their bodies gravitating towards each other, even as they maintained a respectable distance. Everett knew what he was doing was wrong. He was a married man, a father, and Daisy was young enough to be his daughter. He tried to rationalize his feelings, telling himself it was just a harmless flirtation, a midlife crisis that would pass. But in quiet moments, when he lay awake next to a sleeping Imogen, he couldn't deny the growing intensity of his feelings for Daisy. Daisy, too, was conflicted. She had always prided herself on her maturity and independence, but now she found herself falling for a married man. She knew it was cliché, the babysitter and the dad, but she couldn't help the rush of excitement she felt every time Everett walked into the room. She told herself it was just a crush, that nothing would ever happen. But deep down, she longed for more. Their growing connection did not go unnoticed. The children, Phoebe and Jasper, picked up on the change in dynamics. They saw how their father's eyes would light up when Daisy arrived, how he would laugh more freely in her presence. Phoebe, perceptive beyond her years, once asked her mother why Daddy smiled differently at Daisy. Imogen had brushed off the question, but it added to her growing unease. As August wore on, Everett and Daisy's flirtation intensified. They began to manufacture reasons to be alone together. Everett would offer to drive Daisy home, taking the long road and parking in secluded spots to continue their conversations. Daisy would stay late after the children were in bed, claiming she was helping to tidy up, but really waiting for a moment alone with Everett. One evening, as they stood in the kitchen after everyone else had gone to bed, the tension between them reached a breaking point. Everett reached out to brush a strand of hair from Daisy's face, his hand lingering on her cheek. Daisy leaned into his touch, her heart racing. For a moment, They stood frozen, teetering on the edge of a line they both knew they shouldn't cross. It was Imogen's voice, calling from upstairs, that broke the spell. Everett and Daisy sprang apart, guilt and desire warring on their faces. As Daisy hurriedly gathered her things to leave, they exchanged a look that said more than words ever could. They both knew that whatever was happening between them had gone too far to ignore. The pivotal moment came on a sweltering day in late August. Imogen had taken the children to visit her parents for the weekend, leaving Everett alone in the house. He had told her he needed to catch up on work, but in reality, he had other plans. Daisy arrived under the pretense of picking up some art supplies she had left behind. The air was thick with anticipation, as Everett invited her inside. They stood in the foyer, the tension between them palpable. Then, as if drawn by an invisible force, they came together in a passionate embrace. Their first kiss was electric, years of pent-up desire and forbidden longing pouring out in a single moment. Everett's hands tangled in Daisy's hair as she pressed herself against him. All thoughts of propriety and consequences forgot. What followed was a whirlwind of passion and guilt. They made love frantically, desperately, as if trying to make up for lost time. Afterwards, lying tangled in the sheets of the guest bedroom, neither could bring themselves to use the marital bed. Reality began to set in. Everett was consumed by conflicting emotions. The exhilaration of new love warred with the crushing weight of guilt. He thought of Imogen, of their children, of the life they had built together. But when he looked at Daisy, her youthful beauty glowing in the afternoon light, he felt alive in a way he hadn't in years. Daisy, for her part, was overwhelmed by the intensity of her feelings. She had never experienced anything like this before. The thrill of being with an older, experienced man was intoxicating. Yet, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was betraying Imogen, who had always been kind to her. Despite their misgivings, neither Everett nor Daisy could bring themselves to end the affair. They began to meet in secret, stealing moments whenever they could. A quick kiss in the laundry room while Imogen was upstairs with the children. Hushed phone calls late at night. Clandestine meetings in out-of-the-way cafes where they were unlikely to be recognized. The risk of discovery only added to the excitement. Every shared glance, every brush of hands when passing in the hallway, was charged with secret meaning. They developed a code, innocuous phrases that held hidden significance. When Daisy mentioned a new photography project, it was a signal that she wanted to meet. When Everett talked about a challenging client, it meant he couldn't get away. As their affair deepened, both Everett and Daisy began to fantasize about a future together. Everett imagined leaving Imogen, starting a new life with Daisy by his side. He pictured introducing her to his colleagues as his partner, watching her photography career blossom with his support. Daisy dreamed of traveling the world with Everett, of gallery openings where he would proudly stand by her side. But these fantasies were always tempered by the harsh light of reality. Everett knew that leaving his family would devastate his children and potentially ruin his career. Daisy, in her more lucid moments, recognized the naivety of her dreams. She was barely out of high school, with her whole life ahead of her. Was she really ready to become a stepmother, to deal with the fallout of a messy divorce? Still, they persisted in their affair, each encounter leaving them craving more. They became reckless, taking greater risks to be together. Everett began to invent business trips, booking into local hotels where Daisy would meet him. Daisy lied to her parents about where she was spending her nights, creating elaborate cover stories to hide her true whereabouts. The strain began to show in other areas of their lives. Everett's work suffered as he spent more and more time orchestrating his meetings with Daisy. He became distracted in meetings, missed deadlines, and his once stellar reputation began to tarnish. Daisy's plans for her gap year fell by the wayside as she focused all her energy on her relationship with Everett. Her photography, once her passion, became a distant second to the all-consuming nature of their affair. As summer began to wane, Everett and Daisy's relationship intensified. They became more daring, more desperate in their encounters. The thrill of secrecy was wearing off, replaced by a gnawing desire to be together openly. Neither of them realized that their carefully constructed web of lies was about to unravel, with consequences more dire than either could have imagined. As autumn leaves began to fall, Imogen Blackwood's suspicions reached a fever pitch. The nagging doubt that had plagued her all summer had crystallized into a cold, hard certainty. Something was definitely going on between her husband and the babysitter. Determined to uncover the truth, Imogen embarked on a covert investigation. She began by scrutinizing Everett's behavior more closely. She noted the late nights at the office, the sudden business trips, the hushed phone conversations that abruptly ended when she entered the room. Each observation was a piece in a puzzle she was terrified to complete. Imogen's first concrete step was to check Everett's phone records. She waited until he was in the shower one morning, then quickly scrolled through his call history. Her heart sank as she saw Daisy's number appearing with alarming frequency, often late at night or early in the morning. Next, she turned her attention to Everett's computer. She felt a twinge of guilt as she opened his laptop, but her need to know overpowered her scruples. It didn't take long to find what she was looking for. In Everett's email, she discovered a trail of messages between him and Daisy, thinly veiled under the guise of discussing her photography portfolio. The language was carefully neutral, but Imogen could read between the lines. References to meetings and private critiques made her stomach churn. As her investigation deepened, Imogen found herself transforming into someone she barely recognized. She installed a hidden camera in the living room, justifying it as necessary to protect her family. She began following Everett, parking down the street from his office, and watching who came and went. She even considered hiring a private investigator, but couldn't bring herself to involve an outsider in her family's turmoil. The emotional toll of her sleuthing was immense. Imogen's yoga classes suffered as she struggled to maintain her calm, centered persona while her inner world was in chaos. She found herself snapping at the children more often, then drowning in guilt over her short temper. Sleep became elusive, her nights filled with vivid nightmares of Everett and Daisy together. Despite the mounting evidence, a small part of Imogen still clung to the hope that she was misinterpreting everything. Perhaps Everett was just mentoring Daisy, taking a fatherly interest in her career. But deep down, she knew this was wishful thinking. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. Imogen had told Everett she would be teaching a workshop all day, but in reality, she had cancelled her classes to follow him. She watched from her car as Everett met Daisy at a small cafe on the outskirts of town. Through the window, she saw them holding hands across the table, their faces close together in intimate conversation. As tears blurred her vision, Imogen realized that her worst fears had been confirmed. The life she had built, the family she cherished, was built on a foundation of lies. In that moment, something inside her hardened. The hurt and betrayal crystallized into a cold, implacable resolve. Wiping away her tears, Imogen started the car and drove home, her mind racing with possibilities. She now had all the evidence she needed. The question was, what was she going to do with it? That evening, as Everett returned home, the tension in the air was palpable. Imogen sat at the kitchen table, a glass of red wine in front of her, her face a mask of calm that belied the storm raging within. As Everett hung up his coat, she spoke, her voice eerily controlled. "Everett, we need to talk about Daisy." The color drained from Everett's face, but he quickly composed himself. He forced a casual tone as he asked what she meant. Imogen's eyes narrowed as she laid out her evidence. The phone records, the emails, the clandestine meetings. With each revelation, Everett's denials grew weaker, more desperate. He tried to gaslight her, accusing her of paranoia and invading his privacy. But Imogen stood firm, her voice rising as she described what she had seen at the cafe. Everett's facade crumbled, replaced by a mixture of guilt and defiance. "You don't understand, Imogen. Daisy and we have a connection. She sees me in a way you haven't in years." Imogen's carefully maintained composure shattered. She lashed out, hurling accusations and insults. How could he betray their family? What about their children? Did their years together mean nothing? Everett's responses swung between remorse and justification. He spoke of feeling trapped, of rediscovering passion with Daisy. He claimed he still loved Imogen, that he never meant to hurt her. But his words rang hollow in the face of his actions. As the argument escalated, neither noticed Phoebe standing in the doorway, wide-eyed and trembling. It was only when she burst into tears that her parents realized she was there. The sight of their daughter's distress momentarily united them as they rushed to comfort her. In the aftermath of the confrontation, an uneasy truce settled over the Blackwood household. Everett promised to end things with Daisy, to recommit to their marriage. Imogen, exhausted and emotionally drained, agreed to try and work things out for the sake of their children. But as they lay in bed that night, a chasm between them, both knew that things would never be the same. The trust that had been the foundation of their marriage was irreparably damaged. And unbeknownst to Everett, the seeds of a far darker plan were already taking root in Imogen's mind. In the days following the confrontation, a suffocating tension permeated every corner of the Blackwood home. Everett and Imogen moved around each other like wary strangers, their interactions stilted and formal. The children, picking up on the undercurrent of hostility, became clingy and irritable. Imogen watched Everett like a hawk, noting every phone call, every late night at the office. She vacillated between bitter anger and desperate hope, clinging to Everett's promises to recommit to their family. But deep down, a part of her knew it was too late. The damage had been done, and the idyllic life she had worked so hard to build was crumbling around her. Everett, for his part, found himself torn between guilt and resentment. He tried to focus on his family, to recapture the love he had once felt for Imogen. But thoughts of Daisy continually intruded, her youthful passion a stark contrast to the Cold War at home. Despite his promises, he couldn't bring himself to cut off contact with Daisy completely. The breaking point came on a crisp October evening. Imogen had planned a family dinner, a last-ditch effort to salvage their fractured relationships. She had spent hours cooking Everett's favorite meal, even enlisting the children's help to set the table. But as the hours ticked by and Everett's chair remained empty, her hope turned to ash. When Everett finally stumbled through the door well past midnight, the scent of unfamiliar perfume clinging to his clothes, something in Imogen snapped. The carefully constructed facade of forgiveness and reconciliation shattered, revealing the raw, seething fury beneath. The ensuing argument was brutal, years of pent-up resentment and betrayal pouring out in a torrent of accusations and recriminations. Imogen screamed about sacrificing her career for their family, about the years she had spent supporting Everett's ambitions. Everett retaliated by painting Imogen as controlling and suffocating, claiming she had stifled his dreams and individuality. As their voices rose, so did the stakes of their argument. Everett, pushed to his limit, finally admitted that he was in love with Daisy. The words hung in the air, like a death knell for their marriage. Imogen, her world collapsing around her, made a desperate ultimatum: Daisy or his family. Everett's hesitation was all the answer Imogen needed. In that moment, something fundamental changed within her. The last vestiges of the woman she had been, the devoted wife, the loving mother, withered away, replaced by a cold, implacable resolve. As Everett continued to talk, making promises they both knew he wouldn't keep, Imogen retreated into herself. She nodded mechanically, letting him believe he had won her over, but behind her eyes, a plan was forming, a dark, twisted path that would lead to unimaginable tragedy. That night, as Everett slept fitfully beside her, Imogen lay awake, her mind racing. She thought about the life she had built, the dreams she had sacrificed, the love she had poured into her family, and she thought about Daisy, the young woman who had so casually destroyed everything. In the cold light of dawn, Imogen made her decision. If she couldn't have the life she had worked so hard for, then neither would Daisy. With a clarity that should have frightened her, Imogen began to plot her revenge. She would make them pay, Everett for his betrayal, Daisy for her youth and beauty, both of them for the happiness they had found in each other's arms. As she finally drifted off to sleep, a small, mirthless smile played on Imogen's lips. They had no idea what was coming, but soon, very soon, they would learn the true cost of their affair. The plan came together with a frightening ease. Imogen moved through the following days in a haze of cold determination, her every action calculated and deliberate. She maintained a facade of normalcy, even managing to convince Everett that she was coming to terms with the situation. On a chilly Saturday morning, Imogen put her plan into motion. She suggested that Everett take the children to visit his parents for the weekend, claiming she needed some time alone to process everything. Relieved by her apparent acceptance, Everett readily agreed. As soon as the car disappeared down the street, Imogen sprang into action. She called Daisy, her voice carefully modulated to sound warm and conciliatory. She invited the young woman over, saying she wanted to clear the air between them. Daisy, caught off guard by the unexpected olive branch, hesitated before accepting. As she made her way to the Blackwood home, a mix of hope and apprehension swirled in her chest. Perhaps, she thought, there was a way to resolve this situation amicably. When Daisy arrived, Imogen greeted her with a brittle smile. She ushered the young woman into the kitchen, where a bottle of wine and 2 glasses waited. As they talked, Imogen's manner was eerily calm. She spoke of forgiveness, of understanding the heart's folly. With each sip of wine, Daisy felt herself relaxing, believing that perhaps everything would work out. It was only when Daisy's vision began to blur that she realized something was terribly wrong. As she struggled to stand, panic rising in her throat, she saw Imogen's mask of friendliness melt away, replaced by a look of cold, implacable hatred. What happened next was a blur of violence and terror. Imogen, driven by a rage that had been building for months, lashed out with a brutality that shocked even herself. The kitchen, once a place of family gatherings and laughter, became the scene of an unthinkable crime. In the aftermath, Imogen stood over Daisy's motionless form, her hands shaking and her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. The reality of what she had done crashed over her in waves, each one threatening to drown her in horror and regret. But it was too late to turn back. With a detachment that would later horrify her, Imogen began to clean up the evidence of her crime. She worked methodically, her mind oddly clear as she erased all traces of Daisy's presence from the house. As night fell, Imogen made one final call to the police. Her voice trembling with manufactured fear, she reported Daisy missing. She spun a tale of the young woman failing to show up for her babysitting duties, of calls gone unanswered, and a gnawing worry in her gut. As she hung up the phone, Imogen caught a glimpse of herself in the hallway mirror. The woman who stared back at her was a stranger, hollow-eyed and haunted, with blood-stained hands and a soul irreparably damaged by the weight of her actions. In that moment, Imogen realized that in her quest for vengeance, she had destroyed not just Daisy's life, but her own as well. The tragedy she had set in motion would have far-reaching consequences, forever altering the lives of everyone involved. The disappearance of Daisy Summers sent shockwaves through the quiet community of Oak Ridge Heights. As news spread, neighbors gathered in small groups, their hushed conversations a mix of concern and morbid speculation. The Blackwood home, once a symbol of suburban perfection, became the epicenter of a growing storm. As the investigation intensified, cracks began to appear in Imogen's carefully constructed alibi. Surveillance footage from a nearby gas station contradicted her account of her movements on the day of Daisy's disappearance. Inconsistencies in her statements raised red flags for the seasoned detectives working the case. The breakthrough came when a hiker discovered Daisy's phone in a wooded area on the outskirts of town. The device, while damaged, yielded a treasure trove of information, including text messages that painted a clear picture of her relationship with Everett. With this new evidence, the focus of the investigation shifted dramatically. Everett found himself the prime suspect, his infidelity seen as a possible motive for Daisy's disappearance. As he was brought in for questioning, the carefully constructed life of the Blackwood family began to crumble once and for all. Little did the investigators know that the true culprit was hiding in plain sight, her guilt eating away at her with each passing day. The tragedy that had befallen Daisy Summers was far from over, its repercussions continuing to ripple through the lives of all involved. The trial that followed was a media sensation, laying bare the dark undercurrents that had run beneath the surface of the Blackwoods' seemingly perfect life. Imogen was sentenced to life in prison, her fall from grace complete. Everett, while cleared of direct involvement in Daisy's death, saw his reputation and career destroyed by the scandal.